The pages stick to my fingers tonight, stained with the grease and soot of industrial machinery. Here, written in the smoke-darkened hand of Carlo Collodi, I find not a tale about wooden boys becoming real, but the systematic documentation of how real children were turned into wooden tools for industrial profit. The ink itself seems to shimmer with the sweat of factory floors, the tears of children who worked until their hands bled, the oil that kept the machines running that consumed their childhood. This ancient tome has revealed genocides disguised as fairy tales. But tonight, it shows me something equally insidious: how industrial capitalism transformed the systematic exploitation of children into moral entertainment. Pinocchio wasn't trying to become a real boy. He was trying to remember what it felt like to be human, before the factory took that away from him. Welcome back, seekers of forgotten truths. The Blue Fairy wasn't offering magic. She was offering the same lie that factory owners told working children every day: be good, be obedient, work harder, and someday you'll be free. Once upon a time, there lived a poor woodcarver named Geppetto, who carved a puppet from a piece of pine wood. That night, the Blue Fairy visited his workshop and brought the puppet to life, naming him Pinocchio. She told the wooden boy that if he proved himself brave, truthful, and unselfish, he would become a real boy. To help guide him, she appointed Jiminy Cricket as his conscience. But Pinocchio was easily led astray. On his first day, instead of going to school, he was lured away by the fox Honest John and the cat Gideon, who sold him to Stromboli's puppet show. Stromboli forced Pinocchio to perform for crowds, keeping him locked in a cage when he wasn't on stage. Though Jiminy Cricket helped him escape, Pinocchio's troubles weren't over. The fox and cat convinced him to visit Pleasure Island, where boys could smoke, drink, play, and do whatever they wanted without consequences. The island was a trap. The boys who indulged too much were transformed into donkeys and sold into slavery. Pinocchio barely escaped, though he sprouted donkey ears and a tail as punishment for his behavior. Meanwhile, Geppetto had gone searching for his wooden son and was swallowed by the giant whale monstro. Pinocchio dove into the sea to rescue his father, showing the bravery and selflessness the Blue Fairy had demanded, though both appeared to die in the process. The Blue Fairy rewarded Pinocchio's sacrifice by bringing him back to life as a real boy, finally granting his deepest wish. It's a story that generations have interpreted as a moral lesson about the importance of honesty, hard work, and listening to your conscience. But the pages before me reveal something far darker. Carlo Collodi wasn't writing fantasy when he created Pinocchio in 1883. He was documenting the industrial exploitation of children in northern Italy, where the rapid mechanization of production had created an insatiable demand for small, quick fingers and bodies that could fit into spaces too narrow for adults. To understand the true horror of Pinocchio, you need to understand the Italy of Collodi's time. The newly unified nation was desperately trying to catch up with the industrial development of Northern Europe, and that desperation fell heaviest on the country's most vulnerable population: its children. By 1880, over 400,000 children under the age of 14 were working in Italian factories, mines, and workshops, often for 12 to 16 hours per day. The ancient tome reveals contemporary accounts that read like horror stories. Parliamentary Commission reports from 1879 describe children as young as 6 years old working in textile mills, their small fingers perfect for threading needles and repairing broken threads while the machinery was still running. Medical reports document the systematic physical deformation that resulted from this work: curved spines from hunching over machines, missing fingers from industrial accidents, respiratory diseases from inhaling cotton fibers and chemical dyes. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from factory inspection reports that describe the psychological condition of these working children. Inspectors noted that children who had worked in factories for several years showed what they called mechanical behavior. They moved and responded like machines rather than human beings, showing little emotion, creativity, or independent thought, had become, in the words of one inspector, living puppets, controlled entirely by the needs of industrial production. This is where the true meaning of Pinocchio becomes clear. The wooden puppet represents not a magical creation, but the psychological state of children who had been systematically dehumanized by industrial labor. They weren't born wooden. They were made wooden by a system that treated them as replaceable tools rather than human beings. Geppetto, the kindly woodcarver who creates Pinocchio, represents the factory owners and foremen who recruited children for industrial work. In Collodi's original Italian, Geppetto's name is a diminutive of Giuseppe, but it also carries connotations of mastro, a master craftsman who controls his apprentices. The loving father who carves Pinocchio from wood represents the industrial system that carved real children into economic units. The blue fairy's promise that Pinocchio can become a real boy through good behavior reflects the false hope that factory owners offered to working children. They were told that if they worked hard, obeyed orders, and didn't complain about their conditions, they would eventually earn enough money to escape factory life and become real members of society. But the system was designed to ensure that this escape never happened. Parliamentary investigations revealed that child workers were typically paid just enough to survive, but never enough to accumulate savings that might allow them to leave factory work. They were charged for their food, their lodging, and even the tools they used, ensuring that they remained perpetually in debt to their employers. The promise of eventual freedom was a deliberate lie designed to maintain compliance and prevent rebellion. Jiminy Cricket, Pinocchio's conscience, represents the internal moral voice that the industrial system systematically destroyed in working children. Factory labor required absolute obedience to external authority and the suppression of independent moral judgment. Children who questioned unsafe working conditions, who protested unfair treatment, or who showed concern for their fellow workers were quickly dismissed or punished. Contemporary accounts describe how factory foremen deliberately worked to eliminate what they called troublesome conscience in child workers. Children were taught that their only moral obligation was obedience to their supervisors, that questioning authority was selfishness, and that their suffering was necessary for the greater good of industrial progress. Jiminy Cricket, as small size and frequent ineffectiveness in guiding Pinocchio reflects the systematic effort to minimize and eventually eliminate the moral voice in working children. The character of Honest John the Fox, who repeatedly leads Pinocchio astray, represents the labor recruiters who traveled through rural Italy, convincing desperately poor families to send their children to work in northern factories. These recruiters were known for their persuasive lies about the opportunities awaiting children in industrial work. They promised education, training, fair wages, and eventual prosperity. But families who sent their children with these recruiters rarely saw them again. The children were transported hundreds of miles from their home communities and kept in company housing that made escape nearly impossible. Letters home were censored or prohibited entirely, and families were told that their children were too busy learning valuable skills to visit. The Fox's smooth talking and false promises perfectly capture the techniques used by these professional child traffickers. Stromboli's puppet show, where Pinocchio is forced to perform for crowds while being kept in a cage, represents the public display aspect of child labor that made the system socially acceptable. Factory tours were common in Collodi's time, where middle-class visitors could observe the industrious children at work and congratulate themselves on supporting a system that was teaching valuable skills to the poor. These tours carefully concealed the brutal reality of factory life. Visitors saw children during daylight hours when they were most alert, in the cleanest sections of the factory, performing tasks that had been rehearsed to look educational rather than exploitative. The children were coached to smile and express gratitude for their opportunities, just as Pinocchio performs happily for Stromboli's audiences while being imprisoned between shows. Pleasure Island represents the most insidious aspect of the child labor system, the way it was presented as liberation rather than exploitation. Factory recruiters often promised children that industrial work would free them from the restrictions and hardships of rural life. They could earn their own money, make their own decisions, and enjoy the excitement of city life. The transformation of the boys into donkeys on Pleasure Island reflects the systematic dehumanization that occurred in factory settings. Children who initially showed enthusiasm for their new freedom gradually lost their human characteristics. Their creativity, their emotional responsiveness, their ability to form meaningful relationships, they became beasts of burden, capable only of the repetitive physical labor that the industrial system required. Medical reports from the period document this transformation with clinical precision. Doctors noted that children who had worked in factories for extended periods showed what they called industrial dementia, a condition characterized by mechanical movements, limited emotional range, and inability to engage in complex thinking. They had literally been transformed from human beings into biological machines. The whale monstro that swallows Geppetto represents the industrial accidents that were epidemic in child-employing industries. Factory owners were required to maintain minimal safety records, and these documents reveal the horrific toll that industrial work took on children's bodies and lives. Textile mills reported an average of 1 child death per week from machinery accidents, poisoning from chemical dyes, or respiratory failure from inhaling cotton fibers. But the whale also represents the larger industrial system that consumed entire families. When children were injured or killed in factory accidents, their families were often forced to send more children to work in order to pay for medical care or burial costs. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating, ensuring a constant supply of child workers. By creating economic conditions that made child labor seem necessary for family survival. Pinocchio's rescue of Geppetto from the whale's belly represents the tragic reality that working children often felt responsible for their family's economic survival. Children as young as 8 years old carried the psychological burden of knowing that their family's ability to eat, pay rent, and survive depended on their willingness to endure whatever conditions the factory imposed. Contemporary social workers' reports describe children who refused medical treatment for work-related injuries because they were afraid that time away from work would cause their families to starve. They described children who worked with broken bones, infected wounds, and serious illnesses because they had been taught that their family's survival depended on their continued productivity. The Blue Fairy's final transformation of Pinocchio into a real boy represents the false promise of social mobility that was used to justify the child labor system. Society told itself that factory work was actually helping poor children by teaching them skills and work habits that would eventually allow them to rise in social status. But statistical analysis of factory employment records reveals that this upward mobility was virtually non-existent. Children who entered factory work typically remained in industrial labor for their entire lives, often dying young from work-related diseases or injuries. The few who managed to escape factory work usually did so by becoming labor recruiters themselves, perpetuating the system that had exploited them. The transformation into a real boy was a fantasy designed to make middle-class readers feel comfortable about a system that destroyed hundreds of thousands of real children. By suggesting that the suffering was temporary and would be rewarded with eventual humanity and happiness, the story made it possible for society to ignore the ongoing reality of child exploitation. But this ancient tome reveals the most disturbing truth of all. Pinocchio was unjust, reflecting the child labor system. It was actively used to maintain it. Factory owners and labor recruiters used Collodi's story as a recruitment tool, reading it to rule families to convince them that sending their children to work in factories was actually an opportunity for moral and social advancement. Company records from textile mills describe educational programs where Pinocchio was read to child workers, with explicit instruction about the moral lessons they were supposed to learn. Marginalia in factory-owned copies of the book include notes like, "Emphasize the rewards of obedience," discuss the dangers of questioning authority, and explain that current hardships lead to future happiness. The story was specifically used to combat children's natural resistance to industrial labor. When children complained about working conditions, expressed homesickness, or showed signs of depression, factory supervisors would remind them of Pinocchio's story and explain that their suffering was a necessary part of becoming real, that is, economically productive members of society. Church records from industrial regions reveal how religious authorities participated in this systematic psychological manipulation. Priests would use Pinocchio in sermons specifically addressed to working children, explaining that obedience to factory discipline was a Christian virtue that would be rewarded by God. The Blue Fairy was explicitly compared to the Virgin Mary, blessing children who accepted their suffering without complaint. Medical records provide the most heartbreaking evidence of how effectively this psychological programming worked. Doctors noted that child factory workers showed remarkably low rates of complaint about their working conditions. Even when they were clearly suffering from serious work-related injuries or illnesses, they had internalized the message that their pain was necessary and temporary, that expressing dissatisfaction was selfish and morally wrong. These children had learned to see themselves as Pinocchio, not yet real, not yet deserving of the rights and protections that society offered to real people, but potentially worthy of humanity if they proved themselves through sufficient suffering and obedience. It was a form of psychological control so effective that victims became complicit in their own exploitation. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation of Pinocchio's true meaning. Excavations at former factory sites in northern Italy have uncovered dormitories where child workers lived in conditions that would have been illegal for housing animals. Sleeping spaces barely large enough for a child's body, no windows or ventilation, shared facilities that fostered the spread of disease. But perhaps most tellingly, these excavations have also uncovered toys and personal items that reveal how completely the children had been cut off from normal childhood experiences. Instead of dolls or games, archaeologists find miniature tools, practice pieces for industrial work, and crude carvings that show children trying to recreate the mechanical environments that dominated their lives. The psychological adaptation required for survival in these conditions was profound. Children learned to find identity and meaning in their work rather than in relationships, creativity, or personal growth. They became quite literally more comfortable functioning as tools than as human beings. Modern psychologists who study the effects of child labor recognize this adaptation as a form of dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism where individuals detach from their emotional and physical experiences in order to survive unbearable conditions. But for children in Collodi's time, this dissociation was presented not as a trauma response, but as moral development. The pages of this ancient tome grow heavy with the names of children who never got the chance to become real, who died in factory accidents, succumbed to work-related diseases, or survived to adulthood so psychologically damaged that they could never form normal human relationships. They were told their sacrifice was temporary, that their suffering had meaning, that someday they would be rewarded with full humanity, but the reward never came. Instead, they became the foundation upon which industrial prosperity was built. Their childhood transformed into profit, their humanity carved away as systematically as Geppetto carved his puppet from pine wood. The story of Pinocchio persists in modern culture as a tale about becoming real through moral behavior. But its true function was always to convince real children that they were yet human enough to deserve protection, comfort, or freedom. It taught them that their value lay entirely in their productivity, that their feelings and desires were obstacles to overcome rather than valid human experiences to be honored. Today, more than 150 million children worldwide are engaged in child labor, many in conditions that would have been familiar to Pinocchio's original readers. They are still told that their sacrifice is temporary, that their suffering will be rewarded, that someday they will become real members of society, if they just work hard enough and complain little enough. The Blue Fairy still visits them in the form of corporate social responsibility programs that promise education and opportunity in exchange for continued compliance with exploitative working conditions. Jiminy Cricket still speaks to them through the few adults who try to advocate for their rights. But his voice is still small and easily overwhelmed by the machinery of economic necessity. The ancient tome whispers that the story's power lies not in its fantasy elements, but in its documentation of how societies convince themselves that the systematic destruction of childhood is actually beneficial for children. By wrapping exploitation in the language of moral development, by presenting suffering as education, by promising eventual rewards for present compliance, the story provides a template for making any form of child abuse seem acceptable. Pinocchio was never about becoming real. It was about learning to accept being treated as less than real, about finding meaning in servitude, about transforming the natural human desire for freedom and dignity into shame and guilt. It was about carving away everything that makes childhood precious until only economic utility remains. Tonight, as these smoke-stained pages whisper the names of children, whose stories ended not with transformation into real boys and girls, but with early death and broken spirits, I remember why this book chose me as its guardian. Not to preserve comfortable lies about moral development, but to expose the machinery of exploitation that is hidden behind stories of growth and redemption for centuries. Tomorrow night, the tome will reveal another beloved story that taught children to accept the unacceptable, to find virtue in their own victimization, to believe that their humanity was something they had to earn rather than something they possessed by right of birth. But tonight, we remember the real children behind Pinocchio's wooden mask, the mill workers whose fingers bled from threading needles, the mine workers who died in tunnel collapses, the factory workers whose lungs filled with poison as they created products for others to enjoy. They were already real. They were always real. And they deserved so much better than to become entertainment. The reckoning continues.